Welcome to this series of videos on gender-sensitive project implementation in a rural context. My name is Elna and I'm a consultant with Resilience. Over the past few months, I've conducted a gender analysis for one of our irrigation projects in rural Mozambique. This series of videos is a summary of the framework that I've used for the gender analysis, the methodology, the results, and some practical tools and recommendations for future project design and implementation in an agricultural context. This is the fourth video of this series, in which I will further elaborate on the results of our gender analysis study in rural Mozambique. The results will refer back to the framework that I've explained in the first video of this series, including access to resources, roles and responsibilities, and the corresponding needs and priorities for female farmers, as well as the importance of beliefs and perceptions influencing the three domains mentioned before. The most prominent in access to resources were the farmers' perceptions on finances. And the key finding here is that all farmers long for stability in income. And they would like to have a stability in income to be able to invest in agriculture to commercialize. So the thing is that farming is a seasonal activity, and so therefore it can be very risky, as the months where one generates income often do not comply with the months with the high expenses. And this is something that we mostly got from the seasonal calendar. Then next to that, farming is prone to unforeseen circumstances. For instance, a bad harvest due to cyclones or sudden lack of customers due to high competition. So when talking to farmers about this topic, we learned that they currently try to reach this stability in income in three ways. Either doing seasonal work, having an extra business, or keeping and selling livestock. Seasonal work provides with stability because it is this one activity that you perform for a couple of weeks and you just generate a set amount of money, so you know what you get. An extra business could be profitable since it provides you with an extra income next to agriculture, but the downside of extra businesses is that you need to be able to invest already in the first place. And then livestock is beneficial since it is reproductive, so it keeps adding, and you can sell the livestock whenever you want to. So most farmers sell their livestock when they are in need of money, and therefore they can use the livestock to take the blow in difficult times. So they use these three methods, but they would rather have the means to produce all year round, to have the security of customers, and to store projects. One of the exercises that we did related to access to resources was to ask farmers about their expenses and the size of their expenses relative to the others. And so shown here are the 5 expenses that farmers indicate to have the most priority for, which are education, food, housing, agriculture, and lastly clothing. On the left, you see the answers given by female groups of farmers, and on the right, you see the answers given by male groups of farmers. And I would like to emphasize here that in a group exercise, these were answers that they have decided on collectively. Groups range from 5 to 15 persons per group. The size of the circles show the extent of that expense relatively to the other expenses. And so you can see here that women indicated that education is their largest expense, followed by food, and then followed by housing. However, you can also see that food and education almost have the same level of priority, as the circles are almost the same size, whereas housing also scores higher than agriculture, which may be a bit unexpected, but this is quite of a colored response since a lot of women in Yamatana in the Sofala province indicated that housing was a large expense for them, which is mostly because of the cyclones in the area. So if we would have disregarded Yamatana in this case, then agriculture would have been higher. So then it would have been education, food, agriculture as the ranking of expenses for female farmers. Then for the men, you can see that agriculture has been their largest expense, followed by food, and then followed by education. And you can see here that the differences between the circles are larger than in the case of the women, indicating that both male groups agreed on this ranking, whereas the female groups were a bit more in disagreement, sometimes gave a different type of ranking. And so the sizes of the circles are closer to each other. So we ask about their expenses, but we don't necessarily believe that female farmers have more or larger expenses or different types of expenses than male farmers. So what we actually do believe here is that this illustrates the differences in priorities between women and men. So if you look at the responsibilities of women, it is mostly to take care of their children, as they are the primary caretaker, whereas for a man, on the other side, they are responsible for the generation of income needed to provide stability for their family. And so this could explain why female farmers think of education as a larger expense first, since this relates directly to their children, whereas men think of agriculture first, since this directly relates to generating income for their family. And then, of course, food is a shared responsibility and shared priority for both of them. And so it makes sense that this is the second expense for both groups. So we can say that men and women prioritize their expenses differently, but with a side note, because we can ask ourselves whether it is because of choice or whether it is because the roles and responsibilities appointed to them by society make them push into a difference in priorities. We then ask farmers how they manage their finances, and this graph illustrates a total of 34 individual responses on this question. So 34 different people have explained their financial management. 9 of these were men and 25 of these were women. And the graph only includes responses of married women and men. So divorcees and widows, for instance, are not included in this graph. What strikes the most is that 45% of the female responses indicated that the wife is the one who keeps the money, whereas on the other hand, 45 of the male responses say that financial management is a shared responsibility, with each of them having their own expenditure responsibility. And with their own expenditure responsibility, I mean that they really divided it up. So for instance, the income generated by the woman is spent on education, whereas the income generated by the man is spent directly back into agricultural responsibilities again. But interesting to highlight here is that there were no men who stated that the money was being kept by their wives. And also all responses from women saying that they keep the money were from Maltese, from the Tet province. Linking this graph to beliefs and perceptions, we feel that it may have been favorable for men to say that financial management is a shared responsibility, since this is a more modern perception of the vision of the household. And generally, it is perceived that the men are in charge of the finances, that is culturally set, and that the women should ask their husbands for permission. So as a man, to say that you share your finances means that you have a more of a modern view and you disregard this generalization of cultural beliefs. But concluding, we would say that there's a large variety in how farmers perceive money sharing, and that the generalization of money just being kept or being managed by the man is not true. So these are the results relating to access to resources, and the following results relate to a farmer's roles and responsibilities, mostly referring to a division of time and a division of labor. To understand the liberty in decision-making and the right of ownership on production and income, we ask farmers whether they work together with their spouses on their fields or whether they work on separate fields or separate plots. And the graph here shows that there is no significant difference between the female and male responses on this question, indicating that both male and female farmers perceive the division of fields and labor similarly. However, women informed us that separate fields allow for ownership over the project. This is mostly because she has to do the work herself, and so the income that she generates by that field is for herself, and her husband also agrees on that. This is, however, especially the case for smaller amounts of money. So when the sum of money gets larger, she often has to hand over that amount of money to her husband for him to manage. However, we would like to emphasize that although women link separate fields to independency, it is not the only way for a woman to gain ownership over the produce or over the income. So it really depends on the agreements made between husband and wife. And an example of this is a story of one of the male farmers that we met on the market, who told us that they work on the same field together, but that they have divided their fields into plots. So the money generated from his plot was more for productive purposes, whereas the money generated for her plot was more for domestic purposes. Then another exercise that we did was asking farmers about their daily schedule. And so we really asked them to explain to us at what time do you get up, and what is the next activity, and at what time. So we really asked them to lay out their daily schedule for us. And illustrated here is a generalized daily schedule of female farmers on the left of the slide, and a generalized schedule of male farmers on the right. Also, these are two schedules from the months of October/November, and these are indicated to be the most labor-intensive months, since farmers need to prepare their field for the rain-fed season. The difference that I would like to emphasize here is that they have a lot of similar activities. However, female farmers need to divide their time between the household and the field work. And so women tell us that they find it very heavy to have this responsibility between housework and field work. And they say that they feel limited in the division of their time. Whereas men also say that it is a large burden to be the one most responsible for the income and for agricultural production, and that they have to spend so much time on the field. And they would say that their women actually get a bit more rest, since they perceive the household to be less labor intensive than the work on the field. We then also asked the question whether the woman gets help in the household or whether it's her own responsibility. And of all the responses that we got, it has been mentioned 5 times that the husband will help, and it was mentioned another 5 times that the husband would help in case the wife is sick. Then for the rest of the 12 individual responses, it was stated that it is fully the wife's responsibility. And then it was also often stated that she already got help from the children, and so it wasn't necessary for the husband to help, or they would be in a polygamous marriage, and so there would be multiple wives to share the household responsibilities among. And generally, the previous slide tells us that farming is a very labor-intensive activity, and that it takes a lot of time in a day, in a week, in a month to be a farmer and to share between housework and the field. And this was also shown to us by the seasonal calendar, which showed us that December and January, and then with a range from October to February, are the most labor-intensive months for farmers, since they have to prepare their fields for the rain-fed season. The quote shown here at the bottom of the slide also shows this difference between labor-intensive months. So the women told us here that they are always in the field from October until January, and then they had to laugh and they said, these are the months where we get smaller and smaller. And then eventually we will get bigger again when we are able to eat the sweet potatoes, which is during harvest season, more going up until June. We also asked women about their availability in participating in projects, and especially about training availability. And we noticed that since women have these fixed responsibilities, they prefer to have trainings on regular weekdays and regular times. In our cases, they often responded that they would prefer to have trainings on Fridays from 7 in the morning up until about 9 in the morning. Then we try to summarize the answers given by farmers on access to resources and roles and responsibilities by summarizing it into their needs and priorities. And our main conclusion was that all female farmers spoken to have this need of an increase in independence. And more specifically, they have a need for autonomy, knowledge, and finances. So autonomy relates to decision-making power and liberty, knowledge relates to education and agricultural training, and finances relates to being able to manage your own finances or control your finances together with your husband, by which we can think of access to credit, Papanza groups, or for instance, having livestock, having a side business. So as long as it is something that allows them to gain more independence, it will be beneficial. It will be perceived as beneficial to them. However, getting this independence relates to cultural beliefs and perceptions, as already explained before. And I would like to emphasize again that these beliefs and perceptions have influence on one's roles and responsibilities. Again, also to access to control over resources, and this altogether summarizes farmers' needs and priorities. Keep in mind that beliefs and perceptions are the beliefs and perceptions set in the household and the beliefs and perceptions set in the community, which may be different. It may be that in your household there are more modern views or more liberal views, whereas in the community the beliefs and perceptions are still more conservative and more set. So the household views and community views doesn't necessarily have to relate to each other. And because of this difference between household norms and values and community norms and values, it may be that the variety in gender relationships is actually limited to show, since these community values don't allow for a lot of variance. And on this slide here, we generalize some of these perceptions, and especially in the context of Mozambique, where a study has been done, we learned that the man is often perceived to be the head of the household. And so this can also mean that he would like to have more control, since if something happens or if the circumstances become less, then he will be the one that people will look up to, and he will be the one to be judged. Another point that female farmers refer to is the lobolo. As a bit of an explanation, the lobolo is the money that the husband and his family pay to the wife and her family. And it is therefore a means to secure the respect and the obedience of the wife towards her husband and his family. But one of the downsides of this payment is that it makes it more difficult for a wife to actually leave her husband, as in those cases she will have to pay him back the lobolo, which is often something that she cannot afford since she doesn't have the money anymore, or the money is a shared responsibility and so it is fixed by the husband. Since these values are so cultural rooted, it may be difficult to publicly renounce from them. And women told us that it is possible, but then it should be, as they called it, their marital secret. So a woman can earn more money than her husband, or invest more, for instance, in the house than her husband, as long as the community thinks that it is still him who has full responsibility. And an example is shown here in the quote at the bottom from Katandika, where this woman said that this year she bought 2 goats and she paid for the goats, but she didn't tell other people that she paid for the goats. So to the community, she will tell that it was her husband who actually bought them. Whereas in reality, both her husband and she knows that she was actually the one having the responsibility of the goats. And then there were a few points that came up in the conversations with our technicians. So actually this slide is a summary of something that our technicians reminded us of. Which is that cultural beliefs and perception are rooted, but over time they are also changing. And in general, from the conversations that we've had with our technicians, but also with the farmers, is that for cultural beliefs and perceptions to change, it is very important to have these examples of change. And so the examples for gender equal relationships, for instance, are being set by others. And one example is a farmer who in Yamatanda who told us that they saw another couple sharing everything together, doing everything in dialogue, which was actually a more modern type of relationship. And then they told us that they saw that it decreased friction between the husband and the wife, and so they saw that it worked. And then he and his wife tried to have some similar agreements, and he noticed that it was very beneficial for his marriage. So as a project, we could think of incorporating these examples into our trainings. Examples could be from neighbors or family members, but examples could also be set in the household. And so I would like to emphasize that gender inequality is passed on from mother to daughter and from father to son. So it is a generational change. And so it is very important to put emphasis on what is it that you teach in the household. So when, for instance, a woman is cooking and her son asks her to help her, and then the husband will tell, no, why are you asking that? That's a woman's job. Then you are setting an example. And then lastly, in doing so, we should be aware that it is a responsibility for both men and women. And so as a project, it is very important to include both male farmers and female farmers in our project. And when, for instance, working only with female farmers, to not disregard the opinions or the concerns of male farmers, but include them actually in what we are doing with their wives, and what the objective of our project actually is. Thank you again for watching this video. In the next and last video of this series, I will elaborate on practical tools and recommendations for future project design and implementation. I hope to see you in that video again.